Well, thanks for coming out, everyone, today. My name is Tom Lanning. I'm Director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. Welcome to our Ream Library and to this afternoon's event. This is part of one of the Center's major initiatives called Catholics and Cultures, which explores the religious lives and practices of contemporary Catholics around the world. The Catholics and Cultures website, catholicsandcultures.org, features articles, data, photos, videos, and the like on what it means to be Catholic in about 25 different countries around the world in 9 Eastern churches, with new content added often. We're thrilled by the way it's grown and been received worldwide. Catholics and Cultures has been significantly enriched in a really crucial and complementary way by the launch of a scholarly e-journal, the Journal of Global Catholicism, in the fall of 2016. We're only 3 issues into it, and wrapping up our production under the leadership of Professor Matt Schmaltz and Mark Listow. Matt's the founding editor, Mark's an editor as well. It's been rewarding not only to read the articles, but as I was telling our speaker, to be able to track sort of where it's watched around the world. There are those little things that drop down on the page, and how many people in really different places in the world are downloading and reading which articles. So we're up to over 2,000 articles in the 3 issues so far, which is pretty good for a scholarly journal that's getting started, so I feel really grateful about that. I mention that because 2 of the issues that we've recently published are on African Catholicism, and they were enabled in part by the work of our speaker today, Father Stan Chu Ilo. Last July, Matt Schmaltz and I were also grateful to be able, for the opportunity to join Stan at the International Palaver on African Catholicism in Nairobi, Kenya, an event which our speaker organized. We got to experience how wide his web of scholarly relationships is in on the continent, and we're delighted to have him host him here today for a talk on Catholic and Pentecostal Charismatic movements in Africa. Father Stan Chu Ilo is research professor at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University. He holds a doctorate in theology from the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, and is completing a second doctorate in sociology of education with the University of South Africa. He's an ordained Catholic priest in his home country, Nigeria. He's visiting faculty at the Institute of Social Ministry and Mission, Taganza University College, Nairobi, Kenya, and is the founder and director of Canadian Samaritans for Africa, a nonprofit that works directly with African women to help alleviate poverty. He's director of the African Christian Studies series for Pickwick Publications with Stock Publishers, a commenter on Africa, religion, and politics for Canada Television and Al Jazeera, a columnist for CNN African Voices, Catholic Register, and Premium Times, and a blogger on the Huffington Post's World Affairs, Religion, and Black Voices sections. He's author of A Poor and Merciful Church, Illuminative Ecclesiology of Pope Francis, which is coming out in 2 weeks, okay. Editor of Love, Joy, and Sex in a Wounded World, African Commentaries on Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, and of a book that's the theme of today's talk, Wealth, Health, and Hope in African Christian Religion, The Search for Abundant Life. So please join me in welcoming my friend, Father Stan Chu Ilo.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you everyone for being here. And thank you for the invitation, Tom and Matt, and for wonderful friendship and mentoring, because I learned from you guys just in the great work that you have done. And what I want to do today is going to be threefold. So first is I will try to identify what we mean when we talk about African Pentecostal and African Charismatic, these movements. What do we mean by Pentecostal and Charismatic? And then I use 5 different experiences to tell the story. And these stories will lead me to, 3 firm conclusions that I will make and 3 suggestions. Just why does this matter to an audience like all of you here? So let me make a very important clarification. The use of the term African Pentecostals and Charismatics will refer to any of these 6 groups identified by Omenyo and Atiemo in their typology of African Pentecostal and Charismatic movements in Africa. So there are 6 kinds of people who identify themselves one way or the other with the term. First is the African initiated churches, or African initiatives in Christianity, or African independent churches, whichever way, we have multiple terms for this. It's called AIC. So you would say they will identify themselves as Pentecostal or Charismatic. Some people might say, no, you are not. The second is the classical Pentecostal movements that have their roots here in the United States, going back to William Seymour's Azusa Street revivals in North America, which began in 1906, and some other groups which emerged due to African initiatives without Western influence that has the character of these classical Pentecostals. The third is the trans-denominational Pentecostal fellowship, that is, Pentecostal groups that cut across Africa that has or have links with North American, European, Asian groups. For instance, the Full Gospel Business Fellowships, the Women Aglow Fellowship, etc. Then there is the charismatic renewal groups found in the mainline churches like Roman Catholic Church, Anglican Church, and some other mainline churches. The fifth will be the independent New Pentecostal Charismatic churches. And the sixth, what you might call the Neo-Prophetism, which joins traces of some of these groups, AICs, Neo-Pentecostal churches. So the term charismatic and Pentecostal are often used synonymously in not only in African Christianity, but also in world Christianity. In this presentation, I will use the distinction made by Kwabena Asamoah Giyadu between Pentecostalism and Charismatism. According to him, and I quote, Pentecostalism may be defined as that stream of Christianity which emphasizes personal salvation in Christ as transformative experience wrought by the Holy Spirit. And then charismatic will refer generally to historically younger Pentecostal independent and parachurch movements, many of which function within non-Pentecostal denominations. Now, the expression charismatic itself derives from St. Paul's reference to charismata pneumatica, that is, gifts of the Spirit, as found in 1 Corinthians chapters 12 to 14. Thus, St. Paul uses the expression to refer to those extraordinary divine graces that believers manifest on account of their experience of the Holy Spirit. However, whereas there is a distinction between the Catholic charismatics in terms of their institutional and ecclesial structuring in many dioceses in Africa, for example, and other forms of charismatic and Pentecostal Christian movements, it is important to note that this distinction is more at the level of institutional activities rather than at the level of worldview, whether it's cultural knowledge, cultural symbols, or cultural artifacts. So I'm going to concentrate on locating the common stream which waters these groups, while showing at the same time the specific Catholic dimension in my presentation. It is important to note from a perspective of global Catholicism that the Catholic charismatic movement owes its origin back to 1967, when Belgium Cardinal Sunet secured Vatican approval for the birth of the Catholic charismatic movement in world Catholicism, which led to the first Catholic charismatic mass at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome in 1977. The Pentecostal movement is capturing the spiritual imaginations of many Catholics today, and more so in Africa. It is then into this complex context that I identify the Catholic charismatic group in Africa as a type of Pentecostalism which is moderated by the formal structures of Roman Catholicism. However, in many instances, the members of the Catholic charismatic groups continue to gravitate between multiple worlds which exude the features of Pentecostalism in general, like speaking in tongues, healing ministries, explosions of miracles, casting out demons, predicting the future, healing people of ancestral curse, destroying the powers of principalities and enemies, whether in witchcraft or what they call obanje in my culture, breaking the yoke of poverty and breaking the cycle of debts in the family, among others. They may do this through the Pentecostal method of healing and patterns of ritualization in many instances, but they also appeal to traditional Catholic spirituality and sacramental life, but not exclusively to this for the realization of the end for which a particular instance of possession demands. However, within the wider Catholic structure, one would notice that there is a strong attempt to place the Catholic charismatics under the leadership of priests, to place the movement back to cultic exercise of priestly ministry, and to house their prayer meetings within traditional Catholic spirituality, especially Marian devotion and the cult of the Eucharist and the saints. African Catholics in Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire, where I have studied these Catholic charismatic movements, are struggling to release the spirit under the stranglehold of Catholic clerical gatekeepers. There are tensions with regard to baptism in the Spirit, speaking in tongues, and how to authenticate prophecies and the normal initial evidence, which must accompany one's initiation as a Catholic into the Catholic charismatic movement. This is not typical to Africa, but as we shall show, these tensions point to different manifestations of African Catholicism. My interest in the Pentecostal and charismatic movements have been shaped by 5 personal experiences, which I wish to share with you. Now, from the point of view of personal experience and also personal conviction, I think that theological studies and research for me are not disinterested exercise. It's not simply an intellectual quest, even though it is, but it is also for me a ceaseless search for intelligibility in what I believe and what I teach. This is particularly so because, as you heard in the introduction, I am also a Catholic priest. The personal condition for my believing and for what I teach and what I hope for and what I live is really, for me, the basic inspiration for my scholarship in theology and the social sciences. So, the rest of what I will say here, I structure around 5 personal experiences. And I will use those experiences to tell the story of African Pentecostal and charismatic movements. But I just want to show you on the slide 2 very important points that will flow through what I will say in these experiences. First is what I consider the common features that you find in African Pentecostal and charismatic movements, identified by most scholars. One is the experience of God's love in the community through actual faith of persons, spiritual gifts and manifestations in persons and places. Now, the places could be anywhere. It could be on the mountain. It could be while people are sleeping. But this is pretty common. Then the other one is expression and celebration of God's love through communal witness, common liturgical celebration, common action, and communal solidarity. 3, the communication. So they move from experience, a lot experiential based, and then they express in interaction with others, and then they communicate because they also have an agenda of dominion. So it's not just something that they keep to themselves. They want to go out. Communication of God's love and action in the community
through stories of healing, restoration, transformation, and miracles. Then, I think then this is where many scholars remain at the level of explanation of what happened or what is happening through conflicting theological accounts, some positive, some negative, based on denominational interpretations given or the opposition from established churches and the state. So it's not just that the explanation might not be accepted by, institutions like the Catholic Church or even institutions in the state, but also even among the Pentecostals, there is also contestation about, how do you give an explanation of what is happening? So many people will say, well, that's going to be an expiration date. Actually one bishop told me this in one of my encounters. He said, well, you are interested in these groups. Why don't you research on something, else? Because these groups will have an expiration date. Unlike the Catholic Church that has been here forever, these groups will come and go. So the question, again, I hear, what kind of ecclesial life is that? How do you define this? What's going forward? And then, how do we transfer this to the next generation? Is this the kind of experience of Christianity that is transferable? And what do you transfer if many of the narratives revolve at this personal experience? And how do you validate or reject? And then you find, in general again, the common features, the experience of the Holy Spirit and the many gifts of the Spirit, especially the gift of speaking in tongues and healing, located outside the sites of formal church structures. But I think this point is changing. They are beginning to be formalized structures in many places now. They are located outside the big city centers, but in the suburbs, ghettos, and roadsides, so they are turning the suburbs into downtowns because it's now attracting more people. In Nigeria, going to Lagos is the largest city in Africa. Now, going to Lagos, the Redeemed Church of God has this mountain, place of meeting. Whenever they're meeting, there's going to be traffic. So you better forget traveling to Lagos that day because this single church will have sometimes over 500,000 people. So there is also strong leaders. So they are less cultic and ritualistic. When you go to Pentecostal, like you have, in the Catholic Church, the priest will have the missal or missalette. Sometimes you don't have those kinds of books. Then some people still regard them as very marginal faith groups. But some also say they are searchers for solutions rather than researchers of doctrinal differences. So they don't worry so much on this level. They worry, especially in Africa. But as we will see, this is also a bit nuanced. They search for solutions to problems. Experiential and practical approach rather than formal and theoretical approach. A more direct and open harvesting of the gifts of the Holy Spirit rather than a controlled ecclesial attitude and defense when it has to do with discernment. How do you discern? So then there is diffuse leadership rather than centralized or hierarchical leadership. So you will find people who found churches or Pentecostals who pray in the car, in the bus. They can come to the marketplace. We have them in villages in the morning having what you call morning cry. They are trying to preach like Jesus did. So they receive this gift from the central leader. So you have a very diffused leadership style. Unlike, say, the Catholic Church, where you have to go through a lot of processes in order to become a priest. Here in Pentecostal, going through the period of the Life in the Spirit seminar, then you get qualified to, proclaim the word. And then an openness to gift exchange. So there's a lot of interaction among the Pentecostals. So people even help each other to found churches. I know a friend of mine in Burundi. He's from Congo. Now in Burundi, he has started, within the last 5 years, he has started more than 400 churches. And when they're talking about churches, is where two or more are gathered in my name. So, it's not like, having a big church or chapel like what you have here. So it could be in an uncompleted building. It could be in someone's barn. It could be in someone's kiosk where they are selling. They turn it on Sunday into a place of worship because as many of them believe, just like Moses, wherever you stand is holy ground. Then there are more inclusive and flexible approach to ministry and problem solving rather than controlled or structured approach. Now, my stories. The first account was, and I will just tell this without really going into my text. My sister became a Pentecostal in the late 1980s, and we shared a room because we were born the same day. We shared the same birthday, but we were born different years. And she would start her prayers at 10, and then we'll pray into the midnight. And she'll be speaking in tongues, and every time she starts, I'll have to go out, So I was sleeping in the living room because her prayer was quite intense. And, she'll be sweating profusely from her battles, which is normal, not only, that Africa is not as cold as here, but, after all that intensive exercise, she'll be sweating. So I remember my dad, telling her, are you going to continue with this crazy group? If you continue, it's not going to give you a career and it's not going to give you a husband. So my dad was the Secretary General of the Diocesan Pastoral Council. So he was so happy. One day he came back to report to us that, the bishops of Nigeria have now come up with a law that Catholics should not copy from the Pentecostals. Even the Catholic Charismatics should not copy from the Pentecostals because they are watering down the faith. So early in my study, I therefore wanted to find out whether Pentecostals and Charismatics in Africa were crazy people. I wanted to know whether my sister was crazy and whether there is something wrong with my sister's kind of faith. I have been particularly interested in how the African Pentecostal movement, how their map of the universe is like and unlike the map of the universe in African traditional religion, and whether their map of the universe is similar to what Catholics believe and what Catholics practice. And I would say that my research points constantly to the fact that the worldview remains the same. That is the worldview of cause and effect, the worldview that you find in Africa that says that abundant life emerges through my participation and sharing in that bond of life that is rooted in ancestral traditions. So the good that I have, the values that accrue to me, will grow to the extent that I am connected with all the positive values of my ancestors. So somehow that evil is the result of someone dismantling or warring against the procurement or participation in this common bond of life. And so when I study these Pentecostals, I am concerned about their lived faith experiences, the stories they tell, their actual faith, much more than maybe whether that actual faith squares up with, beliefs in, that we find in the creed. The second experience for me was quite personal, the death of my sister that I just mentioned. My sister died out of, pregnancy-induced hypertension they call preeclampsia. So after her death, members of our group came to our family and they said that, we saw her death in a prophetic vision. And we also see that more deaths will come to your family if you do not allow us to come and heal the family root. And rightly so, as you will suspect, my father turned them down, said, I do not believe in this thing you're saying. As a staunch Catholic, I believe that you say your rosary, you say your family prayer, you go to Mass, do charity, live an honest life. That's all that God asks of you. So I was quite concerned, what is this kind of revelation that the Pentecostals and Charismatics in Africa claim? How do you authenticate this claim to seeing what will happen and interpreting what happened and predicting the future? How do they understand the movement of history? How do they interpret the dialectics of good and evil? And how do you understand limit situations, sicknesses, diseases, death, and the last things? This has been an ongoing quest for me. According to Chu Ilo, whose work on African Pentecostalism I find the most authoritative so far, he says that missionary historiography and accounts by Western colonial administrators, travelers, and anthropologists gave the impression that the African gods have been in retreat. That is, that African traditional religion is in decline. Relying as they did on external data, they concluded that Western rationality, science, and the Christian faith had displaced the traditional religious systems and cultures of Africa. Such displacement was perceived as a sign of the ethical, scientific, and spiritual superiority of Western Christianity over African traditional religion. In addition, the speed with which Africans converted to Christianity was also seen as a proof that Africans freely gave up their fetishes and other aspects of their religious practices for the Christian faith. Many anthropologists like James Fraser concluded that religious changes in Africa validate the evolutionary unilinear theory of the abandonment of religious traditions by so-called primitive societies for a higher religious tradition, a view validated by Weber's secularization theory. Thus, religious change was interpreted in African traditional religion. Some people interpreted religious change among Africans as a validation of a social evolution and an inevitable progressive movement that Africans have embraced. Now, this is some of the conversation that is ongoing among African social scientists, especially sociologists of religion. So, is the fact that many Africans who embrace traditional Christianity in more specific sense, the fact that many Catholics are now turning to Pentecostal, is that a conversion? Does that validate religious change? What has taken place? So how do you distinguish between, say, my sister's faith when she was a Catholic and now that she became, or when she became a Catholic charismatic, a Pentecostal African? So what is the difference between African traditional religion, becoming Catholic, and becoming African Pentecostal? These are some of the questions that I continue to think about. And then the final personal experience I wanted to share was also the multiple deaths that occurred in my family between 2013 and 2014. So in my extended family, we lost 4 of my cousins within a space of 2 years. And, you know, the one very close to me, who was 23, she had a heart condition that, you know, they called that she had a narrow mitochondrial valve in the heart, and which could be corrected through a stent. And, you know, I tried what I could to bring her to receive medical attention in Toronto, where I was then teaching, but unfortunately she did not get a visa to come to Canada. And so she had a stroke and died. Now, her mother said that it's someone in the family who had struck her with a spell while she was pregnant. So she left the Catholic Church and joined the Pentecostal, praying that her daughter would get a miraculous healing. and unfortunately, she died. And when she died, it was like, again, the group came saying, we need to do this prayer in order to liberate the family from death. So, amidst these kinds of deaths in my family, I wanted to investigate further what is going on in order to be able to help not only my own family, but so many people whose stories in Africa are stories of death, stories of sickness, stories of poverty, stories of very permeable religious adherence and loyalty, moving from one church to the other, from one religion to the other, gravitating from one belief system to another. And the fifth story is what I'm going to ask Jasmine to play for us. We'll listen to the journalist. It kind of captures these whole stories, and then we'll form the basis of the final commentary that I will make. So let us listen to the news.
Realized a few weeks ago in a community in Enugu State, that southeast Nigeria, has been turned into a mecca of sorts by miracle seekers. The lake is believed by many to have healing powers. TBC News correspondent Carl Ofoye was one of the latest visitors to the lake. He tells us more.
This is the famous Nachi Lake that has been attracting thousands of miracle-seeking people daily since it materialized on November 11, 2013. The vehicles that bring people daily from far and near to the lake are usually in hundreds. But funny enough, the Nachi Lake's water is not like any other lake water you may have seen. It is thoroughly dirty and its smell is overpowering. However, this does not deter people who besiege it daily with one health challenge or the other from diving into it. Some in critical conditions who cannot enter the lake on their own get assisted by their relations to dip their frail bodies in it. Ironically, all the people I spoke with looked forward to a miracle after bathing in the water and cared less about how dirty it is.
This is my mom, so she's sick, and there are a lot of challenges as a woman. So I believe on having this water as I came all the way from Abakaliki down to Pipi. So by the special grace of God, all those things, problems and predicament that I'm passing through is over.
I see someone that came this place, he's not working when he come here. When he enter inside the water, his body's okay.
That is why you believe if you take...
Yeah, even before I came this place, I believe when I came this place, everything will be okay.
I saw one man with my blue eyes, hair from the brightness, and another person from the sun in his leg. Spider came out after entering the water.
It is because of this belief that everything around the lake is now taken as a healing object. Trees standing before the lake formed and took over the area have been felled and cut to pieces by miracle seekers who believe that they have the capacity to heal. The surroundings of the lake are currently dotted by holes dug by people scooping clean water to drink and take home for healing and other miracles. Expectedly, every business in Nachi community today is booming. From photographers to people selling jerry cans, from people rendering transport services to people selling kebab, popularly known as suya, they all say they are smiling home with thousands of naira every day.
Small kind of no be small thing. God there, yeah. Since that day when this is that. After every kind of weather here, nobody go talk say they make no less than 8 to 6, 10,000 naira daily. Okada. That's the one who work, you go make 4,000, 5,000. No be small money now. So now God, now Jesus, you don't understand.
So are you praying for this water to remain and not to dry?
If you don't dry, that be say person don't get money now. They pray. Look, you don't dry.
The experience I'm having here now, I never experienced it before. It's wonderful. I'm still even partaking on the miracle also in my business.
They say like you go down today. Go down yesterday. Yesterday I said 15,000. Today they say 10,000. Before this river, how much did they say? They say 1,000 and 3,000.
But how did this lake suddenly come into existence? Who told Nigerians that it has healing powers? Are there evidences or people that have been healed by the lake? Or is this another trick being played on gullible Nigerians bruised and battered by poverty and diseases occasioned by bad leadership and lack of functional healthcare delivery system? This man was one of the early callers at the Nachi Lake when the news first broke, and he still visits the place with his family.
Things started on the 11th of November. The Fulani herds who were carrying cattle, they passed through that dry land. And they're going back around 6:30 in the evening. They heard a sound behind them, and a kind of explosion. And they went down back that place to find out what's happening, only to see water spreading up, as if there's a hose pipe, water pipe that was there, that got busted. So the water keep on striking, spreading up. The man called one of their brothers. He said, look, there's water coming up here. He told him to bring that water. That is the water they were prophesying at Mecca. So that was how the news started. So now this guy got their water, sent to the brother who was blind for 15 years. After taking the water, bet with the water, she started seeing. So through that man, the news spread.
He says the crutches left behind by crippled men and women healed after bathing in the lake constitute enough evidence that it has healing powers. And a Eque's position, and perhaps that of many others like him, means that Nachi's mysterious lake will continue to play host to many people desperate for life-changing miracles in the coming days. But our fear is that there could be an outbreak of contagious diseases in the homes of many of these miracle seekers soon. We say this because of some of the diseases we saw people wash in the same lake that many people bathe in and also drink.
Even though this pool of water behind me is not full of Bethesda that so many of us have read about in the Bible, many miracle seekers who believe in what the water can do for them have turned the pool into a pilgrimage of some sort. But for the period I've been here, I did not witness any miracle. So many who have been assisted into the water were also assisted out by their relation, thus leaving me wondering whether it is their faith that did not see them through. Carl Ofori, TVC News, Nachi, Enugu State, Southeast Nigeria.
Thank you. So that's the fifth story, and this formed the basis of the research that I have in this book that was presented at the beginning. Now, and this place is 10 miles from my ancestral home. So I had to spend 3 weeks talking with people about this experience, and, it formed the foundation of kind of reaffirmed my conviction that I need to be where my people are. And I need to hear and listen to them. And listening to them can help me to develop the phenomenological basis in order to talk with them about God. So I will draw some 5 conclusions here. First of all is that I do believe that Africa is going through a double crisis. The crisis of state and the crisis of religion. And I understand crisis in a positive way. Now, Christianity, especially modern African Christianity, came as a result of the missionary movement, especially in the 19th century, continuing to the 20th century. At the same time, colonialism came also in Africa after the abolition of the slave trade, following the Berlin Conference. Colonialism came to Africa again through the West. And now we have 2 realities that emerged. One was the reality of African Christianity, especially the mainline churches, and the other was the reality of the African state, the states in Africa following the end of colonialism. Now, in politics, what happened after the gaining of independence in Africa was the dismantling of the state by force. So Africa was overwhelmed with a coup d'etat. Almost all countries in Africa, but 2, had this political crisis. So the military were bringing down the state through guns, ammunition. Now, and I think the same thing is happening also. That's my own reading. Is happening also in religion. So you have the established mainline missionary churches founded firmly as this connection with the international center, mainly, for instance, Catholicism. And now you have the Pentecostals emerging within Catholicism, within Protestantism, as a form of resistance to the mainline churches. Now, these 2 crises that I call the crisis of the post-missionary Christianity in Africa and the crisis of the post-colonial state in Africa seem to me to exude common parallel. However, I think, and this is my judgment, that it points us, rather than bemoaning these Pentecostal movements, it points us to one very important reality, that there is something that they need in their heart that they are not finding in the current religious traditions and practices. But it also points to something deeper, and that is, what is that deep desires of their heart, which they are not finding fully realized in the traditional churches? And many people argue that the search for abundant life is at the center of religion in Africa. Abundant life understood as cosmic and human flourishing, that I had referred to as when everyone is participating in the bond of life. People are flourishing, the earth is flourishing, people are flourishing, that is actually what approximates to the authentic desires of every religious practice. And now, this crisis I see as an opportunity, rather than dismiss these groups as maybe crazy people, rather than dismiss these groups as maybe people who are fundamentalists, who are sectarians, or who are sects, that we need to deepen our contact with them, because our folks are here. And you cannot just say, it doesn't matter. While I was there, one of the questions I asked was, even the parish priest where in the Catholic Church where this was happening never came there. So I asked the priest, why haven't you been there? He said, I don't want to give validity to this crazy stuff. So 5 conclusions I want to draw. The first is that the Pentecostal groups represent an attempt to respond to the challenges posed by the insertion of African traditional religions into Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa. In this regard, some African scholars claim that African Pentecostalism is a new form of inculturation of the gospel. The second is the claim that they are the fruits of a growing rejection among African Christians of Western Christianity, especially represented in the mainline churches, Roman Catholic Church, Anglican Church, Methodist, Lutheran, Baptist, and Presbyterian, as well as the Dutch Reformed Church, because in Southern Africa, the Zionist movement is really the strongest and the most populous religious group in the whole of Southern Africa. Thus, some scholars argue that African Pentecostalism is emerging as a result of the fragmentation in post-missionary Christianity in Africa. Some others point to also the competition for space within a very suffocating cultural, economic, political space, where the Pentecostal feature of dominion, taken from one verse in the Bible that says, "Occupy till I come," that the Pentecostals also feel that they will dominate the space in order to weed off other contrary forces that are bringing about the diminishing of this abundant life. The third conclusion is that African Pentecostalism is a response on the part of African Christians to use the resources of the Christian heritage, especially African cultures, biblical narrative, especially from the Old Testament, in challenging the social context that has given them so much suffering, poverty, political instability, diseases, wars, and deaths, which have characterized African history for more than a century. And I'm not an Afro-pessimist, but, I think also one's Afro-optimism must be tailored with some realistic account of what is going forward in African history. Indeed, one scholar called the Pentecostals in Africa factories of hope. That's how he said they offer hope to the people. Whether that hope is valid, again, we have to work out how to validate what that hope is. But I think that that we need to develop new cultural hermeneutics in order to read and understand the Pentecostals. The fourth conclusion is about what is African about this Pentecostal, since they also share a lot of commonalities with other Pentecostals here in North America and in Europe. The African in these groups indicates the primary genre and origin of this movement. And it's very important to understand that Pentecostalism did not originate here in the United States. Classical Pentecostalism, what we call the Big Bang theory of Pentecostalism, that is this big explosion since 1906 that has its origin here in the United States, yes, started here. But from history, there are many other African, indigenous, prophetic, and spirit movements that are still very strong. Some of them interacted with the missionaries, but some of them were actually seen by missionaries and colonialists as some form of distraction, and they tried to kind of how to quench the fire. People like Simon Kimbangu, for instance, Wade Harris in Liberia, who originally started from Ivory Coast. But again, we cannot also forget what we call Ethiopianism. This is a variety of Pentecostalism, if you use that term, that goes back to African slaves here in the United States, who were fighting for the liberation of Africa and blacks from slavery. And then when they came back to Liberia, when they were kind of returned to Liberia, Liberia being the country in Africa that was started by ex-slaves, they brought home with them these streams of Ethiopianism. Some of you will know, Bob Marley, don't you? You know Bob Marley? You know the song, Rastaman, Vibration, yeah, positive. Yeah, that's Bob Marley, like about how do we bring about what some people call the origin, go back to the birthing of the authentic, the real African spiritual heritage. That's a conversation for another day. But others also regard the Pentecostals as a protest movement, a movement that resists the kind of pigeonholing of God. That's why a very common feature of this Pentecostalism or charismatic is the kind of flourishing of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So many Pentecostals actually regard the mainline churches as enemies because they want to capture and tabernacle God rather than allow this outburst of spiritual energy to flourish and then to form and shape the people's imagination. Then finally, the exponential growth, as has been reported, if you read any history of modern Christianity, there is a general belief that Africa is the new heartland of Christianity. And just as we are witnessing a post-Western Christianity and a post-Christian Western society, that Africa will soon again become the new homeland of Jesus Christ. Like Jesus and the Holy Family went into exile in Egypt. Many people claim that Africa is a place, in order to understand the future of Christianity and Catholicism, one must understand the features of present-day African Christianity. And I think that the exponential growth in African Christianity today has been driven more by this Pentecostal movement. African Pentecostals and Charismatics are the fastest growing religious movements in Africa, and also in places like Brazil, Peru, and Philippines. Now, for many, and I am among those who think that this is a very good thing, because you know what? A lot of Catholic priests are now becoming what? Pentecostals, because there is now the battle for membership. When I was born in my homeland, I can't remember any Pentecostal or charismatic groups that existed. Today, the best universities in many parts of Africa are run by Catholics, but also they are competing for students with the Pentecostals, who also run the best universities. The best charitable organizations are run by Catholic Church. Still, the Catholic Church controls about 63% of social services in Africa, health care especially, and education. But the Pentecostals are also beginning to do the same. So it is a good competition. Now, I do not subscribe to, some version of interpretation that says that these are just different kinds of commodities being thrown out there. So religion has become like a shopping mall where there is a bazaar of options. And so increase the options so as to increase competition and then increase quality. I do not subscribe to that, because at the end of the day, one must ask, what is the direction of history in Africa? And how can Christianity be a medium for the emergence, as a part of one of the conversation partners in the emergence of the Africa that offers to people abundant life, the Africa that offers people peace, the Africa where every young person has access to social mobility. And so, by way of conclusion, I raised the same question that Pope Francis raised when he was in Africa, where he talks about how can we deepen the culture of encounter so that anyone who comes in contact with the Christian religion in any of these elements would have a transformative experience, not only for individuals, but also for culture. The second point is that it's very important to suspend quick, uninformed, and unscientific judgment about Pentecostal and charismatic healing and other related phenomena and miracle experiences. In many instances in my own work, I see these Pentecostal groups as having a good intention, which is to purify the church and the world of evil. Indeed, Alan Anderson says that Pentecostals in Africa is Africa's own new version of the Reformation. But then the Pentecostals, some of them, are not only interested in reforming the church, they want to create a new church. So it's very important then that what Pope Francis calls the art of accompaniment, that we as theologians, as pastors, that we accompany God's people in places like this. It's very, very important that we do not just abandon them as crazy people, so that let them do it their own way. I think a deeper theological study, similar to the one I found so many people now doing, is also called for. But it doesn't have to rely solely on traditional theological method. It must be grounded in sociocultural and historical methods, not only in our seminaries, but also in our theological schools, but also in our Catholic universities. I think that Pentecostalism should be studied not only in Africa, but also even here, because it is also, if one may add, it is one of the most vital, most dynamic Christian movement globally. What is happening in Africa is also happening in many parts of the world. And I think that we must work with the people. And I want to actually conclude with a very important quote when I share this story with one of my spiritual directors. He told me this, which is a guiding, I felt like it's a guiding revelation. God telling me something. If I have to speak in Pentecostal charismatic language, I see God speaking to me when he said to me, Stan, your people are crying inside, but maybe your theologians and priests in Africa, you theologians and priests in Africa cannot hear or see their hidden wounds, because you do not see the church present in that messy pond, or Jesus jumping into that pond in the form of these poor people you encountered. So, for me, that pool that they call the Pool of Bethsaida became for me a site of encounter of something deeper, that many Africans are searching for healing. Many Africans are searching for meaning. Their faith is strong, but then how can we understand that search? And how can we become part of that faith journey so that it can bring them to a place where they can experience, even in small ways, a glimmer of the reign of God, which in African traditional religion we call abundant life. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments?
Yes. I think you touched on this kind of in the conclusion, but what can the Catholic Church, Catholics in general, as well as priests, learn from their Pentecostal Christian brothers?
Yeah. One of the things for me, I think one could learn from our Pentecostal brothers and sisters is that God does operate in history beyond the formal structures of our rituals and sacramental systems. And that the things of God can only be followed rather than simply analyzed. So sometimes we kind of create these frameworks within which we think that God operates. So outside of those frameworks, then it becomes problematic. I mean, the baptism in the Spirit is still a big problem among many bishops in Africa. They say, why do you have to be baptized in the Spirit, since you have already received baptism? So I think, is that experience of God that is beyond simply our formal structures and theological or doctrinal systems. St. Augustine said, if you understood God, then it's no longer God. So sometimes we tend to kind of package God so much so that it becomes something really packaged rather than a person who you encounter and whose experience of continues to increase as you approach the margin. Hope that makes sense. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful talk, and I feel like I learned a great deal. I'm very happy that you presented this information. I have a couple of questions. One, I guess the one I want to ask is, what's at stake in calling charismatic Pentecostalism a movement? Generally speaking, especially in religious studies and theology, charismatic Pentecostalism is very often kind of lumped into the category of new religious movements. But very much in accord with what you presented, charismatic Pentecostalism is not very new. It might be over 100 years old, where a lot of people are claiming that it's even older than that. And it's not really a movement. If we're talking just pure numbers globally, 500 million to 700 million charismatic Pentecostal Christians in the world, that's not a movement. That's, a huge chunk of Christianity. In Guatemala, there are now more charismatic Pentecostal Christians than there are Catholics. So it's not really a movement there, it's the established church of Guatemala. So why call it a movement?
Yeah, that's a very nice question. I call it a movement in this regard in terms of the movement of the Spirit in history, rather than the normal characterization of movement in social science, like social movements. It also gives a pointer to the fact that it's not something that could fossilize or can be contained in a particular tabernacle or house in a specific historical epoch. So it's like something that continues the Christian journey. I do appreciate the fact that sometimes the characterization, there are different typologies of classical Pentecostalism. Some people there are some streams of Pentecostalism that is rooted in some forms of messianism. There's also an eschatological movement, those who think that, and that's where it interacts with some evangelical streams that think of this, you better get converted, you better repent because Jesus is coming soon. So it's also understood in that typology as a movement that tells people, get ready, the Lord is near. So let's move to the eschatological future that awaits those who are chosen. This is a particular stream of Pentecostalism called the chosen in Africa. They just call themselves chosen. And, their movement is about God is coming soon, you better get ready.
Yeah, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I wanted to know, especially building from that final word that was our wisdom that was given to you and that you shared, if you could tie a few of the strings in terms of, let's say, the impact of structural adjustment policies and perhaps Vatican Council, and what you call the failure of the post-colonial state in the emergence of the most vibrant part of this movement, especially, and its perhaps transformation or fueling also by certain theology, not simply of hope, but of abundance as the gospel of prosperity, and how all of this partake into making of this kind of new form of tradition.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you see, the Pentecostals, I think there's been, again, I didn't have time to talk about that. There's been, I think, 3 phases of the Pentecostal movement in Africa. One is the one during the colonial system, one occurring immediately after the Second Vatican Council, and then the third phase happening after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So, and that collapse of the Berlin Wall also coincided with the worst forms of economic, political, and social crisis and devastation in Africa. I know as a high school student that we suffered so much because of structural adjustment program, which in my language translates to something that bites you in the head that you're about to have concussion. So really, structural adjustment program in my language, we were kids, we didn't know what it means. They say it's concussion. You become so hungry that you collapse. So the Pentecostals, then the third phase was, as society was fragmenting, there was some sign, some need. How do we find coherence? I mean, some of us believe that, this is my own personal belief, that religion should help people to have coherence so that everything around you can have a harmonious narrative. So people were no longer finding coherence. People were dying of hunger. And that also coincided with the worst phase of the HIV/AIDS crisis. So people were afraid of the future. So in a sense, that was when this emergence of prosperity gospel came to Africa, which I personally do not use, because I think in my language, I can't find, there's no word for, the word for prosperity in my language means ezindo. That means good life. So prosperity is an American capitalist narrative of religion, whereas most people I see here, they don't want to be millionaires. They just want to get healing. They just want to be touched by God. They are troubled. And I did a lot of interviews with people here, and you could see people dealing with business, small business, that is not flourishing. So I think Vatican II gave Pentecostalism, like you see, after the Second Vatican Council, then this Belgian cardinal tried to promote Pentecostalism and charismatic movements in global Catholicism, that it opened up to indigenous movements. And that indigeneity, especially the African All African Conference of Churches, actually came up in 1974 with a moratorium. Missionaries, leave Africa. Aid organization, we don't want you. So we want Africans to preach, promote Christianity, as well as cultivate the land. But even the African Catholic bishops also in the 1975 synod came up with what they call co-responsibility in the church, where they also itemized this, that there are many things happening in Africa, including the new experience of the Holy Spirit, which during the Second Vatican Council, Pope John Paul the 23rd said, we pray for a new Pentecost. So Vatican II is ushered in this new Pentecost. And I think the structural adjustment made Africans to realize that the mainline churches, including our own, were not doing a good job addressing the socio-cultural and especially the economic problems of people. It cannot just be stopped. They needed a praxis. Now, it is an open question whether African Pentecostal and Charismatic movement have offered a praxis to reverse history in Africa. They have offered hope. They have offered claims. But then, as I say in my forthcoming book, there is a difference between being poor in the Lord and being the poor of the Lord. Being poor in the Lord is about praxis. It's not enough to make claims. It's also important to translate these claims into concrete Christian daily practices that makes history with all its ambiguities to conform to God's eschatological kingdom, the fruits of this eschatological kingdom, which should be tangible. Maybe you think I'm talking like a Pentecostal now.
What would you, following up on that, what would you say to people who criticize such movements and practices as distracting from the necessary work for social justice?
Yeah, that's a very important question. But there are strains. Again, Pentecostalism in Africa, there are multiple strains. I know, for instance, the Winners Chapel. Two biggest Pentecostal groups in my homeland. Enoch Adeboye and it just escaped my mind now. The other Oyedepo. These are two, the Winners Church and Redeemed Christian Mission, which has more than 100 parishes in the United States. It's here in 27 states in the U.S. It's from Nigeria. It's not here in Massachusetts. Tom, I know you would love to go and see what's going on there. But they run a very serious social justice. Now you're talking about DACA. Some of my students in Chicago who are from Africa, who is helping them? The Redeemed Church. Now in Italy, when I was studying in Rome, it dawned on me that whereas many Catholics in Italy do not feel a sense of belonging in the churches there, that the Redeemed Church was consciously recruiting Catholics. Most Catholics then in Italy, in Rome, including members of my own family, go to the Pentecostals on Sundays, including the Redeemed Church, because they help them to do the immigration, navigate, the very complex immigration processes, and they have a sense of solidarity. I studied 38 Pentecostal groups when I was doing my PhD, and what I found was that I thought this way, that they are not really involved in a lot of social justice, but I found a lot of solidarity among them. Now, I think their message, some of the messages might also militate against the fight for social justice. But one of the things I found just recently, you look at Africa the way it is today. In my home country, the vice president is a Pentecostal pastor. In Zambia, the former president had to come to a synagogue of all nations in Nigeria on a regular basis to take power from TB Joshua. I visited a politician while I was home, a senator who is a good friend of mine, and I found holy water on his altar. So I prayed for him as a priest. He said, "Bless me." And then the holy water he had was from TB Joshua. TB Joshua is a Pentecostal, a world-renowned Pentecostal pastor. So then I said to him, "Is this TB Joshua's holy water?" He said, "You bet. Oh, my wife brought it here, So, what God has joined together. Let no one put that asunder. So you should use it to bless us." So they are also fighting political war because they think to dominate the political space would help them in order to dominate the socio-economic space. So one of this all businessmen fellowship is so strong in Nigeria. The politicians, all the captains of industries, they are well connected to this Pentecostal group. But on Sunday, some of them, they'll come to Catholic Church. They say, well, we know the Catholic Church is so strong, but we also know that these other people, they are also doing some good work. So, and that's the last point I want to make to this, is that there is some kind of, I think, from my experience as an African and interaction with Africans themselves, that many Africans can live with ambiguity. So what you call syncretism is actually is not either or, but both and. So they are searching, and then they pick one good thing here, they pick the other, and maybe over time, commentators might be able to give it a form. But even right now, I think some of the typologies and navigational equipment we use to study this group have not offered a definitive, answers to how they operate. So, yes and no. That would be my answer.
Let's stop there. That's a great place. And thank you so much for so many things you said.